You have probably heard the phrase that pawns are the soul of chess. As it turns out, understanding pawn structures and how to play them well is one of the key factors in order to grow from 1600 to about 2000 in rating. In this video, I'm going to show a game that was submitted to us by a viewer, and I'm going to explain how both players could have played much better if they had been able to put some pawn play concepts into practice. So let's get started. The game began with knight f3, d5, g3, and knight d7. And I would say that within just a few moves, we are already in a fairly unusual position. It is unusual because white has voluntarily given up control of the center, or rather delayed fighting for the center. And I do think that they are already paying a little bit of the price of doing this. This is not a great opening, in my opinion. Now, here we still have to be careful with white, and we could do well if we start fighting for the center right away. A move like c4 would do a great job. But instead, white played knight bd2, which I would call dubious already. The reason is that knight c3 is a more forward move in general. I'm not saying we should play knight c3 right now, but what I'm saying is that we are so early in the game, we don't even know what pawn structure we are going to play. And because of that, it doesn't make sense to decide to bring the knight to d2, where it will be relatively limited in many of those scenarios. What I'm trying to tell you is that just a few moves from now, we're going to regret having the knight on d2, so we shouldn't have done it in the first place. Now, in this game, white played knight d2, and then black played castle. And now we already have some very interesting position where white needs to make a decision what they want to play. There's a lot of pawn structures that would make sense. In my opinion, the best option already would have been to play e4, hoping for a symmetrical game. So after we play e4, hopefully the opponent will just trade and then maybe we'll take. And this is no more than equality, but we haven't played that well so far with white, so equality is not that bad for us. But instead, white played c4, and this is inviting a Benoni-style position after we played d4. And here, actually, the move knight d2 is already regrettable. You see, if white had played c4 in the previous move and I played d4, now white has a number of options. One of them is e3, and after I take, bishop takes, and perhaps there is an opportunity to break in the center very soon, even right now. And that would have been a healthy way for the game to continue. Now, the problem is, after we play knight bd2 and c4, when I play d4, you no longer have the same options. You see, if you play e3 right now, I'm relatively happy here. I'm just going to take. And then this is not a very healthy pawn structure in the center, because I can play rook e8. And I have a very real threat now. I can play e4. And if I play e4, what's going to happen is the pawn on e3 is likely to end up being isolated. And you see, now with white, whatever you do, you have a little bit of trouble. For example, if you played e4, preventing me, now your pawn on d3 is backward, quite vulnerable, and you have weakened your diagonal as well. I might in fact play knight c5. Here's a funny tactic. I play knight c5 attacking your pawn, and if you defend it with the queen, I can just take it. You cannot recapture because of bishop c5 check. Now, you might think that, well, I mean, how lucky, but not really. I mean, this is why this pawn structure is not good for white. It's like because they're vulnerable to all kinds of nasty tactics. Now, let's say white played d4, hoping that nothing is wrong, hoping that we will just take and move on with our life. But here, actually, we don't have to take right away. One somewhat more annoying response is c6. We delay the capture slightly, and then if our opponent pushes, the point is I want to be able to keep the bishop in the diagonal. Now, what I want to tell you is that here, white doesn't have very pleasant continuations. You see, they would like to develop the bishop, but right now the bishop is blocked by their own knight. The knight on d2 is not very impressive either. It actually blocks the bishop's defense of this point. And anything you do in the center is kind of a hurt in your position. For example, if you trade, I'll just take. Now the pawn is isolated. If you push, I will take. Now this pawn is isolated. Now if you push, I'll just go away. Now this pawn is backward. Either way, you are kind of paying the price just for moving. So actually, I was thinking that the main line that white might play here is b3. Hoping to develop the bishop. But now their position is somewhat incoherent. You see, nothing really works well with each other. So with black, I can just play pawn takes, and now knight g4. I have some threats on the diagonal, and I also have a fork on e3. And the fork on e3 is so annoying that perhaps the best response you have is knight b1 to clear the path for that bishop and perhaps reroute the knight to c3. And now after I play something natural like knight f6, think I have a clear advantage with black. Many blessed continuations. So bottom line, this has not been a very successful opening for white, at least in this line. So the point I'm trying to convey is that if black had really understood some of the pawn structures in play, they would have realized that d4 was a very natural continuation here, exploiting the fact that they have a bit more space and that knight on d2 does not combine well with this setup. In the game, black just played c6, slightly dubious. There's nothing wrong with it per se, it's just that it fails to take advantage of an opportunity. So in that sense, it is wrong. And now white has an interesting continuation. Again, white has to choose what pawn structure they want to go for. So let me give you some funny options. For example, they could have taken and then play e3, hoping to play d4. Looks like a French. Or they could just maybe wait and see what black will do. But the option that I would recommend is to do pawn takes, and now e4. Now it's very important that we don't play a routine move with black. You see, a routine move right now would be to play d4. Now, this is very typical pawn structure. It is a King's Indian type 1 with reversed colors. Typically, when we play with white and we get this pawn structure, we are doing pretty well. But that happens in completely different positions. Let me just very quickly show you where this happens. I'm going to go all the way to the beginning, play with opposite colors, and show you this point. Let's say I played d4, knight f6, c4. So we're going to play a very typical King's Indian. And then I'm going to make a slightly questionable decision with black. You will see in a moment what I mean. Let's say that here I will play c6. I'm kind of trying to collaborate. And then after pawn take, and I'm going to play, I don't know, something questionable. I'm going to play here. And then I'm not even going to play this. I'm going to play h6. And then I will try to play this position. This is incredibly good for white. Why? Well, we have a King's Indian type 1 structure again, but now all of white's minor pieces are in the right locations. You see, we would like to attack the pawn on d6, and we have a knight and another knight, both ready to jump. That's very unpleasant, right? And look at this bishop, look at that bishop, everything working very well together, right? Now, let's go back to the game. I will try to jump to that exact moment so that we can do a side-by-side comparison. The position I want to show you is after d4. Okay, so things got flipped. We flipped colors, we flipped sides, but it's the same thing. For us to have that pawn structure here, for us to have that piece arrangement here, we would need a bishop on e7, and this knight on c6, and this bishop on e6. And if that were the case, everything would be pointing in the right direction. Here, after our opponent plays knight c4 and we play bishops, can't go to e7 because this is hanging. So we go to c7, quick evaluation. This has to be better for white because you see black has like a good pawn structure, but all the pieces are in the wrong spots. And because of that, we can't really execute any of our standard plans. So nothing is really working well for us with black here. So that's another way that you can really sometimes optimize decisions and go into the right middle game is like know what pawn structure you want, know where you want your pieces to be. After our opponent plays e4, actually we have a better response. One simple way to approach this is just accept that this is no more than equality. In other lines, we were playing for an advantage with black, not here. We can just take, and after take, we can play something like queen e7. This is just equality. Nothing more, nothing less. That was one decent way to continue. Now, here, unfortunately for white, they didn't kind of realize that this was the right continuation. So instead, they just played queen a4. Now, let's remember, we have some pawn structures in our mind. Many of them are like Benoni style, King's Indian style, right? With reverse colors always. And I have to tell you, in almost none of those positions is a queen on a4 helpful. So because of that, if the queen is not going to be helpful, what does that mean? It means that this move cannot be very good. It's actually a bad move in my opinion. The only downside for black is that if I play d4 right now, after b4, this is actually not that bad for white because they managed to play b4. And that was kind of a desirable thing to accomplish. But anyway, after queen a4, we have very good responses with black. One of them is we can play a5 and we are still preparing d4. Or we could play maybe rook e8 like it was played in the game. So in the game, black played rook e8, flexible. Maybe we have the idea to play e4 next. And then again, white could have played with pawn takes and so on, but instead they played another bad move, e4. Now, why is e4 a bad move? It's a bad move because it kind of loses some opportunity to perhaps simplify, kind of go into a different type of position. Maybe pawn takes and e4 would have been better, for example. Or maybe b4 right away would have been better. But after e4 with black, I can just play d4. And this already puts you with white in a very difficult spot, right? Now the queen on a4 is not doing much, and I'm about to play a5, claim some space. And now if you play b4, well, actually now I have a very strong response with black. I can react right away with a5. Now I'm threatening the pawn right away. If you take, I'll just take with the, even with the queen I can take. And then try to play this and maybe even go into descending. This is already very unpleasant for white. They have a backward pawn on a2, position is simplified. There's not going to be any checkmate ideas on the king side, which is typical for a King's Indian position. Descendings are not good. So instead of that, after a5, well, I mean, let's say you played a3, trying to hold the position. Then I can break with b5. b5 is another very unpleasant move, right? Now you take, I take. If you go away, I can just take and win a pawn. But if you take it, I'm just kind of, my pieces are so well arranged, so well coordinated that I can just deliver one punch after the other. So here, for example, I took a pawn, and you can't even take the bishop because I trapped the queen. And then if you decide to move the rook away, I can attack your queen. And when you go away, I can attack your queen again, taking a pawn. I'm already a pawn up. And here I would say that white's position is near collapse, probably like -3 already. It's kind of amazing because we're barely on move 15, right? But that's what happens when you play a bad opening, when you play an opening without considering what's the middle game you're aiming for. One thing that I hope you realize is when we look at this game, yeah, this is a game between like 1600, 1700 rated players, but there is so many opportunities that are left behind that we can still learn from if we just dig a little bit deeper. After b4 and a5, yeah, we already know this is very unpleasant. a3 is not good, other moves not good. So the overall outcome is that d4 is already doing very well for black. It would have converted this ambiguous pawn structure into a King's Indian type 2 with reverse colors. And then after a5 or c5, black would have established a comfortable advantage. Now, in the game, they just played knight c5, which is kind of instinct move. It's like, why not centralize the knight, attack the queen? It's just a little bit wasteful because we didn't need to make it. And the queen was not good on a4. Now black played a5, which is understandable, right? It's understandable to play this to prevent b4. But now white had another opportunity to exploit pawn play in order to convert the pawn structure into a more desirable middle game. The way they could have done it is they realized that I am about to play d4 with an excellent middle game, clear advantage at least. And they could have played pawn takes. Here, instead of rook e1, pawn takes. Pawn takes, and now d4. That's a very clever move. Now what's the point? I'm kind of just liquidating the center, transforming the nature of the game entirely, and now let's say I take the pawn. Now pawn takes, bishop takes, take, take. I am a pawn up with black, but it's an isolated pawn. And there's one rule, which I actually mentioned very, kind of very aggressively in my book Chess Structures, is that whenever there is an isolated pawn, it's important to pay attention to which bishop we have. If I had my dark squared bishop, putting pressure and guarding the d4 square, I would be doing quite well here with black. But here, after my opponent plays something like knight f3 and then bishop e3, it's very noticeable that I have the wrong bishop. This bishop maybe will end up passive. Just play here, and after knight d4, I would say that white is doing quite decent here. I mean, white's still a pawn down, so it's not a very desirable position, but I still think that the most likely outcome here is a draw, because white controls the dark squares very well. In fact, maybe now that I look at this a little bit more, maybe bishop d4 is even nicer. And that bishop just looks so good in that square, and the pawn on d5 looks kind of harmless in many ways. I think that here white's problem was not realizing what pawn structure they have, which one they can have, which one they should be aiming for. So here they just played rook e1, which I think is a bad move, because after the opponent correctly closed the center, actually the rook on e1 is slightly worse than it would have been on f1, because on f1 at least is supporting the standard break. So anyway, this is move 11. And believe it or not, black has a clear advantage already, because they have a King's Indian type 2 pawn structure where white is just not putting pieces in the right squares. In terms of plans, well, actually, black has options. One option is just try to play on the queen side, expand, a4, b5, maybe that will transpose to a different structure, but either way is pretty good. Another way is maybe break with f5, which doesn't always work because it weakens this square, but under the right circumstances, it could work well. Meanwhile, white is supposed to attack on the king side. f4 is an idea, and the rook on e1 is not doing its job. Should have been on f1 instead. Now the game continued with h3. This is somewhat unnecessary. And then h6, this is also unnecessary. And in fact, it's so unnecessary that I would call it dubious. And you will see why later in the game. We will end up regretting this move a lot. Would have been wiser to do something else. For example, a4 would have been an excellent move, preventing knight from activating. Now let me show you an interesting continuation. For example, let's say our opponent decides that they need some air, so they want to push. They could play rook b1, hoping to achieve that. And after we play knight fd7, the opponent can play b4. We'll take, they'll take, they want to push. We are not gonna let that happen so easily. So we play knight a6. This should be an instinctive move. I see a hole on b4, I want to occupy it. I see a hole on c5, same thing. And it turns out that after these two natural moves, actually the pawn on d3 is lost. There's no way to defend it, and therefore black is just winning after only 17 moves. Now, let's go back and see how the game went. Black played h6, unnecessary and weakening. Pawn play again. Here's a little concept. Every time you push a pawn, you leave a weakness behind. Here, the weakness is g6. Now, you might say, well, I mean, this pawn is guarding g6 anyway. Sure, that's true. Let's not be absolutist about this. But let's just say that g6 is a little bit weaker than it was before. And so far, I'm not convinced that the move h6 was necessary. So the net effect is this was not that good for us. Now, the game continued with knight b3. And here's another small concept. If you have space advantage, don't trade minor pieces. So here with black, it might have made more sense to just play knight a6 and kick out the knight and then try to go back. But instead, black played knight d7, allowing some trades. So the game continued with rook f1, a4, and trades. I think that trade favored white a little bit, because white has less space, and therefore the trades give them a little bit more breathing room for their remaining pieces. Now, bishop d2. White finally managed to complete development. Now there's only one downside with bishop d2 is that it occupies the d2 square that would have been available to the knight otherwise. So now we have an interesting pawn break with f5. Now this f5 break can be a double-edged sword, and in many positions it's the wrong thing to do because it leaves e4 very weakened. So for example, if white had 4 moves, let's say they could play something like, or even 3 moves. They could play bishop here, then trade, then knight, and then knight to e4. And I would say I already like white's position more, right? Because they have managed to put a piece in this strong outpost. The pawn on e5 is now backward. There's going to be some pressure. I like what white is doing here. Now, obviously, in real life, your opponent doesn't collaborate with you in this way. So after we break and we take, the pawn on d3 is just hanging. There's no time for this luxury. So the opponent will have to play knight e1. And before our opponent has time to do these maneuvers, we can just break right away. e4. And now we just have this combination between space and initiative, which is just massive. Now, the game could have continued with pawn takes, knight takes. Then I can play queen d7, gaining a tempo against this pawn. Then a3, being extra annoying. Right? Now you will probably want to push to avoid creating more weaknesses. And now, I mean, I have many ways to kind of impose my advantage, but here's one that is extra annoying. I can play d3. Now, if you do nothing, I'm going to play like bishop and keep invading. And this pawn on d3 is a very dangerous pass pawn, if you realize this. It's not weak at all. So with white, you kind of have to take it. Now I can play take on g3, take on d3. We have equal material, almost symmetrical pawn structure, but the initiative is just so powerful. These open lines, the open diagonals. Compare the bishops, compare the queens, compare the rooks. Black is just more active. That's it. So the game could have continued with rook f2, bishop c5, rook e2, And then this is just tactics, but at this point I can tell you black is winning. This is like a -4 already. Complete win for black. What's the conclusion? The conclusion is that f5 was a very attractive pawn break in this position. And this happened because white is somehow behind in development compared to like a typical Kinsingtian type 2 structure. Let's go back. After bishop d2, black played bishop e6. Maybe this is why they played h6. They wanted to put the bishop on e6. It's understandable, okay? But maybe this was played prematurely and there were better opportunities. Anyway, the game continued with b4 because white realizes that they are squeezed and they want to claim some space for themselves. Now, pawn take, and again, what does white want to do? Push, right? So there's no reason for us to be giving up space here. Black should have played knight a6, trying to fight for that square. Doesn't mean you're gonna keep it, but at least fight for it. So the game now could have continued with queen b2. We can play queen d7, attacking the pawn. You defend, and now b5. And that's pretty annoying, right? We make it hard to push without giving up that pawn, and then if you trade, this is kind of the point, this is more pleasant for black. Now again, new pawn structure, this is again a Kinsingtian type 1, open files, the pawn on c4 is not there anymore, this diagonal matters, and knight jumping to c5 is unpleasant. So here with white, I would feel forced or almost forced to push to prevent this, right? And black can play knight c7, and start being annoying. Rook a4 is a very annoying move. If you take, I'll take, and this pawn is dangerous, annoying. This is already very difficult to play against. Now, let's say, maybe you're wondering, well, what if I do it first? Rook a5. It's tempting, right? It's like you play rook a5 before the opponent can play rook a4, but tactics are not with you. I can just take, and b4. So annoying. And now with black, I'm threatening queen b5, attacking the pawn on d3, the pawn on a5, and you cannot take here because you will lose material. Some people say that when you play well, somehow you're lucky, right? It feels a little bit like that here. We have made some very good moves with black, so somehow the tactics are just working for us. Not a coincidence. Anyway, so we've seen some lines, but the conclusion is that knight a6, at least as an instinct, should be the first idea in your mind to fight for a little bit of ground. Don't give ground without necessity, right? Now here, black played f6. And there's a little catchphrase, which I've told to my students over the years. The phrase is, if we spend our time protecting what doesn't need to be protected, then we won't have time to protect against the real threats. Okay, so basically, it's like if you start imagining things that are not there, then when something real comes, you will have spent all your time on the fake stuff. f6 is like protecting the pawn, but the pawn was protected in the first place, perfectly safe. And now you realize the problem is that we have this combination between h6 and f6, which means that the g6 square is now weak, right? Between those two moves, somehow now we have some slight problems on light squares. Still not a big deal, but errors accumulate, right? It's like a little problem here, a little problem there, becomes a big thing over time. The game continued with b4, knight a6, queen b2, and here black was still fine. Black should have played queen d7, instead of queen b6, queen d7, attacking the pawn, king, and then c5. That would have been smart. Again, pawn play. What we have to think is what pawn structure would make me happy? And here's the answer. c5. If your opponent pushes, knight b4. Annoying. This is good. This pawn is not weak. This pawn is good. We can play rook a3 next, and rook. And this pawn is not an isolated weak pawn, it's a pass pawn. This is the way we have to think about it. Instead, after c5, the opponent would probably have to take. We take, attacking this pawn, you defend it, and after some trade I can play b5, another good move. I'm just kind of clearing the way. I'm trying to let the essence of the position emerge. What's the essence? Is that after pawn takes and then rook to b8, black has very good winning chances with effectively no risk because of the structure that we have. The pawn on d3 is weak, and there is no weak counterpart for white to be attacking here, so the counterplay is very limited. So this is like, if we play well, maybe I beat you. If we play badly, maybe it's a draw. I don't know. It's like either a win or a draw. No chances for losing unless there is a big blunder. Now the game here continued with queen b6, which was like not the right approach, not super wrong, but not the right approach. Rook b1, c5. Okay, now good move. A little bit of bad, a little bit of good. And here white played b5, and this was the key moment. Black should have played knight b4. This was maybe the last opportunity to be playing for a win as black. Now knight b4, then if bishop takes, pawn takes, and this pawn again is pretty good. But in the game, black played knight c7, and that was a mistake. It's like accepting passivity. You see, we used to have a space and initiative, and suddenly we are becoming passive. Now the knight on c7 doesn't have prospects, doesn't have a place to jump. You should always be careful before making these kind of moves. The knight is stuck forever in the back ranks. And let me tell you what happened. In my opinion, what happened is black thought after knight b4, my opponent will take, and they probably misevaluated this position, right? They thought this pawn is weak. But we have to think more dynamically sometimes. We have to think, I'm going to play here. You cannot attack me because this pawn is hanging. If you defend it, I will bring my rook. And the way that some people think is this. They think, my pawn is weak. Sooner or later, I will not be able to protect it. The correct way to think is, I have activity. I will never give my opponent enough time to attack this pawn effectively. I will force my opponent to take and create a passer way before that happens. That's the right way to think here. And with enough calculation, you can gain the confidence to make those kind of decisions. Now, some people also think, well, I will go back to play it safe. By the way, this is one of the most dangerous phrases people say, I'll play it safe. There's nothing safe about playing passively, right? The only thing safe is that your opponent will feel safe. You are not safe. Now, the game continued with knight h4, and then another slight inaccuracy. Here, black should have played bishop f8, take, and then queen d6. And then we kind of have just enough time to put the game together after take, and then queen b8, and then maybe at some point b6. And the point is that I'm preventing some kind of invasion, so even though I'm not too happy with the position, I'm still holding up. Let's see what actually happened in the game. This was kind of the chain of inaccuracies that amounted to a big problem. Here, black played rook e8, removed the bishop, and after queen a1, there is a big problem because we remove the queen, and here white can play queen a7, and this is a major problem. It's attacking the pawn, and when I protect it, you can play b6, locking the knight forever. Now this is very interesting, right? It's like black has this kind of dominant position for a while, a few inaccuracies piled up, and now the opponent is dominant. And now the weakness of g6 that I was telling you about is really going to matter a lot. So now the game continued with bishop d7, bishop f3, bishop c6, and bishop h5. Now this is very natural, right? You don't need to calculate, just imagine in your head, schematic thinking. Where do you want the pieces to be? Bishop on g6 makes sense, right? So after I play queen d8, bishop a5, protecting the pawn, bishop g6, and things just keep getting worse for black, right? It's like nothing to do. So this is why I'm not showing you variations. They are all the same. It's like you can play king, you can play queen, nothing changes. Now let's see how it ends, because whenever you see how somebody gets squeezed to death, it's like you can learn something, right? So let's learn. Just one line, queen d8, h4, h5. Why not, right? If we can make this improvement, we should make it. In fact, maybe we could make a whole other video about this topic. The topic would be how to make small and gradual improvements in your position. One small improvement we can make is consolidate and support our pieces, in this case the bishop. Now, queen d8, f4, you will see the idea why in a moment. We take and g4, just for the sake of it. And then queen, king comes forward, or okay, bishop e1. Could have come forward as well, but anyway, queen d8, and now we have bishop h4. So that was the whole point. We played, we took, we opened the line, and now we brought our bishop to another diagonal. Why? To be annoying. That's the whole purpose here. Oftentimes, when we get squeezed in these kind of positions, our opponent doesn't know how they're going to beat us. They just know how to make the next move. That's all you need. You don't need a winning plan. You just need the instinct to make one slightly more annoying move each time until the opponent runs out of air. So that's exactly what's happening here. Advance, squeeze, reroute, try one thing, try the other. Eventually the opponent runs out of moves. So here the game could have continued with bishop d7, bishop e7. It's funny because if you take the bishop, I have a fork. Brute force ineffective. Now, let's say you play bishop c6, just waiting more. Then now I have the winning move, knight d6. And the queen is out of squares. So queen plays queen d7, I take. And then when you take, I just take this knight. So the knight spent, what, like 20 moves waiting for its death, and it's finally here. What do we learn from all of this squeezing? Okay, a little bit of technique, but also a little bit of self-reflection about the past. I'm sure that when people get squeezed like this, they start thinking, why did I play h6? Why did I play f6? And suddenly they realize that those moves weren't so necessary to begin with, so they should have never been considered. But anyway, that would have been awesome. But white unfortunately didn't see it. White played f4. Okay, and the game continued with knight c7, take, queen. So this is still annoying, but not nearly as much. And then here, white could have played g4. That would have been the right way to play. And after knight e8, h4, h5, with a little bit of squeezing, but not nearly as much. Because look at the knight. Knight on f6 versus knight on a8. Obviously, the knight on a8 was lost, and this is, I think a draw is more likely. But in any case, I would definitely like to be white, because they have a space advantage and pressure. Anyway, here, white made a mistake that actually won the game. They played knight d6, attacking the pawn, forcing the capture. And here, the point is that they are winning these pawns, right? One of these two. But here, black missed an opportunity to save the game. The opportunity was bishop takes. So we take the pawn, and when our opponent takes, queen takes, and now we have this check. And this is a draw by perpetual check. The whole point is just don't allow the king to escape. Let's say king f1, check, check, check. And then when the opponent tries to run away to d1, we play queen g4 check. Okay, they're all the same. All of the sequences are the same. The whole point is that black needed to find this idea of bishop takes. Now, here's one thought. Some people, they see something, but they don't see it clearly. They see it blurry in their head. I would say in this position, if you have to choose between some uncertain opportunity of perpetual or playing knight e8 and allowing this, I think you should just go for it, because this is definitely lost. That pawn is a very important pawn, and you're still dealing with this other pawn. This is just too many problems. That's just practical advice. Anyway, the game continued with knight f6, and now bishop takes. And here I really like the way that white played, because sometimes it's common for people who are winning to, I guess, let their guard down and start just playing it safe, so to speak. That never ends well, okay? It's like if you're in a boxing match and you got your opponent against the ropes, the best thing to do is to keep punching, okay? Don't take a pause, because your opponent will get back up and suddenly it will be complicated again. So anyway, bishop takes h6, take, and now take. Another excellent tactical brilliance. The point is that after I take, let's say I take. I'm a piece up, but not for long, because white can play check and e5. And when the knight goes away anywhere, there will be a check on h5, and this bishop will be hanging. So now actually, after bishop takes, the game continued with knight g4, check, check, take. Now the knight is lost, and therefore the game is lost. The last bit of the game was a bit messy, with a little bit of tactics and some back and forth opportunities that were missed. So let me kind of summarize what are the key learnings. First, okay, there was an interesting perpetual check. Let's forget about that. Before that, there was a very interesting opportunity for white to play queen a7. That should not have been missed. Queen a7, queen c8, b6. That sequence is not that hard to find. I would imagine that white saw it, but they didn't think they were winning necessarily. What you should know is, yes, you are winning, right? It's like you don't have to calculate everything. Just your opponent's knight is trapped. You can figure it out later, how exactly you're going to squeeze your opponent. Should be possible. That's a little bit of experience, a little bit of technique. Before that, there were some very interesting moments. First of all, practical decisions. You have a knight. Should you go forward or back? Go forward. Unless you see something very crystal clear, go forward. That's a general practical advice. Before that, there were a lot of pawn structure battles. And I think that this was the most important moment and what I would like you to remember the most. There were many opportunities that Black had to convert the position into a clear-cut advantage by knowing what pawn structure they want and why it's supposed to be better for them. And if they had that kind of crystallized understanding, I think they could have won this game very comfortably. Okay? And then also from White's perspective, it's like if they also had that understanding, they wouldn't have given so many opportunities. And finally, there is some kind of more generic advice, but I will tell you anyway, is that don't push pawns unless you really have to. It may not be obvious, but these little pushes really drag you down later in the game, right? You don't realize, and maybe 20 moves later, there is a tactic that only happens because you pushed a pawn that you shouldn't have pushed, right? So sometimes it's hardest to learn from those mistakes because the engine doesn't point them out, or at least it doesn't explain to you why they're wrong, but they are mistakes nonetheless, so we have to learn from them. Thanks for watching. This channel is all about helping you learn and grow at chess. Hit like, subscribe, and join our Discord. It's full of learners just like you who are discussing openings, puzzles, and new video ideas.